Hello, I'm Dr. Lauren Hayes. I'm an emergency medicine doctor from the UK, obsessed with the things that help us to live longer and healthier. And today I'm talking about something that lots of you have requested in the comments of other videos. It's all about a longevity metric that lots of people aren't tracking, but you absolutely should be. It's one that your smartwatch measures every single night, and most people have never even looked at this. Now, you probably know your resting heart rate. You might check your step count. Some of you track your sleep, your calories, maybe even your blood pressure, and that's great. Keep doing that. But there's a single number sitting quietly inside most fitness devices right now that outperforms a lot of those metrics when it comes to predicting cardiovascular fitness, all-cause mortality, and the speed at which your body is biologically aging. Now, the metric I'm talking about here is your heart rate variability. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what this is, why the science behind it is genuinely compelling, and more importantly, what you can do today to start shifting yours in the right direction. What heart rate variability actually is. So, heart rate variability sounds like it should be a bad thing. Variation, instability, inconsistency, but the reality is the opposite of what most people assume. Your heart doesn't beat like a metronome. Even at rest, the gap between each heartbeat changes slightly. Sometimes it's 850 milliseconds, sometimes it's 920, sometimes 780. These tiny fluctuations measured in milliseconds are what we call heart rate variability, or HRV. And the size of those fluctuations turns out to be one of the most information-rich signals that your body produces. To understand why those variations exist at all, you have to understand the two branches of your autonomic nervous system, which is the part of your nervous system that runs everything that you don't consciously control. You can choose to move your muscles, you can choose to swallow or to blink, but your autonomic nervous system regulates your heart rate, your breathing, your digestion, and your blood pressure. And it does this automatically without you having to think about it. Now, on the one side of your autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic system, which most people know as fight or flight. It accelerates heart rate, it sharpens attention, it mobilizes energy. And then on the other side, you have the parasympathetic system, which is largely driven by the vagus nerve, which does the opposite. It slows down your heart, it promotes digestion, it supports recovery, it reduces inflammation, and it essentially is your body's rest and repair mechanism. Now, when your parasympathetic system is active and healthy, it constantly modulates your heart rate in small rhythmic waves. That modulation is what creates heart rate variability. So a high HRV doesn't mean that your heart is erratic. It means that your nervous system has strong parasympathetic tone and genuine flexibility. A low HRV, by contrast, suggests that your system is stuck in a more rigid stress-dominant state. And rigidity, in biological terms, is one of the clearest markers of aging. Why HRV predicts longevity and all-cause mortality. And here's where this gets quite serious, because the research on HRV and long-term health outcomes is not small or speculative. It's actually really, really substantial. So let's start with all-cause mortality. So large prospective cohort studies have consistently found that lower HRV independently predicts earlier death, and that association holds up even after researchers adjust for age, blood pressure, smoking status, and existing cardiovascular risk. Multiple meta-analyses, these big studies have replicated this finding. And what's really, really interesting is that reduced HRV predicts mortality not just in people who are already ill, but in adults who are otherwise considered healthy. The mechanism behind this comes down to autonomic dysfunction, when the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity is disrupted over a long period. Now, it doesn't just show up in how you feel, it shows up in disease as well. Cardiovascular disease specifically has a well-established relationship with a low HRV. Chronic sympathetic dominance, which is the state your body enters when it's under prolonged stress, drives a cascade of physiological changes, which is increased systemic inflammation, impaired endothelial function, progressive arterial stiffness, and a higher susceptibility to heart arrhythmias. Low HRV is associated with elevated risk of coronary artery disease, hypertension, and sudden death. This is really, really important stuff in heart attack patients. HRV is actually now one of the most well-validated predictors of future cardiac events. Moving on to metabolic health. Now, the connections to HRV here are equally significant. A lower HRV is independently associated with insulin resistance, higher levels of visceral fat, and an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Now, the physiology connecting these runs in both directions. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, which drives glucose dysregulation and drives central fat accumulation. And that same chronic stress suppresses vagal tone, which further reduces your HRV. It becomes this self-reinforcing cycle that many people are already caught in without realizing it. And then we've got the inflammation connection, which ties all of this together. Now, a low HRV correlates with an elevated CRP, which is something that we measure every day in the emergency department, and it stands for C-reactive protein, which is a key marker of systemic inflammation, and it represents the biological environment in which accelerated aging occurs, one of low resilience, poor recovery, and reduced capacity to handle physiological stress. Now, HRV in this sense is less of a cardiovascular metric and more of a live readout of how quickly your nervous system is aging. How to measure HRV, Apple Watch, Garmin, Oura, Whoop explained. Now, the good news about all of this is that measuring your HRV no longer requires a hospital appointment or an ECG. Consumer devices have made this really, really accessible, which is amazing. Most wearables now track HRV automatically. Things like your Apple Watch, your Garmin, your Whoop, even that new Oura Ring, which I'm yet to try. All of those measure it to a reasonable degree of accuracy for trend monitoring, and that's the important part. Now, they typically report it as RMSSD, which stands for the root mean square of successive differences between heartbeats, which is the most commonly used consumer-facing metric and the one most closely tied to parasympathetic activity. The most important practical note here is that you need to take a look at your HRV first thing in the morning before you get up. HRV is exquisitely sensitive to context, so posture, breathing rate, any recent activity, and the time of day, all of those influence it meaningfully. Morning measurements taken consistently in the same conditions give you the most reliable signal. But what's even better these days is that many devices also average your HRV across the entire night, which arguably is even more useful than a single morning reading. What matters far more than any single data point is the trend over time. HRV fluctuates day to day. That's normal and completely expected. What you're looking for are the patterns, a gradual improvement over weeks as your lifestyle changes, or a sustained downward drift that might indicate accumulating stress or insufficient recovery. And just one more thing that's worth emphasizing at this point, so you should never ever compare your numbers to somebody else's. This isn't like blood pressure or blood sugar. HRV has significant genetic determinants. It varies substantially between individuals, and it's shaped by decades of lifestyle. Your baseline is your baseline. The only meaningful comparison is yourself against yourself over time. What is a good HRV? RMSSD ranges. So, what is a good HRV? People always want a number for this, and I get that. But a rigid target for HRV misses the point. So let me give you a framework rather than a benchmark. And for reference, here's a really good table that I'll put up on the screen now from something called Training Peaks, which I used to use for my triathlon training that illustrates this really, really well. So HRV declines naturally with age. A 25-year-old athlete and a 55-year-old sedentary office worker will have completely different absolute numbers, and that's expected. As a rough guide, though, values in the range of 20 to 30 milliseconds tend to reflect lower autonomic resilience. The 40 to 60 range represents moderate parasympathetic tone for most adults. Values consistently over 70 generally indicate strong vagal activity, which is most often seen in people with high aerobic fitness and well-managed stress loads. But endurance athletes can sit even higher than that. Now, what temporarily suppresses HRV is worth knowing about because context really matters when interpreting your readings. A single poor night of sleep, or an illness, or significant alcohol the night before, or even a very hard training session will all pull your HRV down meaningfully, sometimes by 20 to 30% in a single night. Now, that isn't a crisis, that's just your body communicating strain. What you should be paying attention to is a sudden drop that persists across several days without an obvious cause or a long-term downward trend that creeps in over weeks or months. Those patterns are early warning signals. Your nervous system is flagging that something in your lifestyle, your stress load, or your health status needs attention, often before any symptoms appear. What low HRV actually means. Now, a low HRV reading, whether that's one morning or a sustained trend, is frequently misunderstood by lots of people. And I want to be direct about what it does and doesn't mean. So, a low reading is not a diagnosis. It doesn't confirm heart disease, and it shouldn't send you into a spiral of health anxiety. What it represents is a signal that your body is under some sort of strain, that the balance between your parasympathetic activity and your sympathetic activity has shifted in a direction that, if sustained, increases biological risk over time. A low HRV sustained over a prolonged period commonly reflects a cluster of lifestyle factors that many high-achieving people accumulate without even noticing. Things like persistent sleep deprivation, a high psychological stress load, regular alcohol intake, a sedentary baseline with occasional intense bursts of exercise, and a diet high in ultra-processed foods. Any one of these independently suppresses vagal tone, but together they create the autonomic environment in which all-cause mortality risk climbs quietly in the background year after year without any symptoms announcing themselves. This is exactly the sort of pattern that I see repeatedly in the A&E. Patients arriving with a first cardiac event or a metabolic crisis who on paper didn't look high risk by conventional measures. Their cholesterol was borderline, their blood pressure was slightly elevated, but their nervous system had been running in chronic overdrive for years and years. Now, HRV, had they been tracking it, would likely have been signaling that dysfunction long before that acute event. How to improve HRV, sleep, VO2 max, breathwork, alcohol, stress. So, at this point, you might be wondering, okay, Lauren, I get all of this, but how do I actually move the needle on this? And the honest answer is that HRV isn't a single lever problem. It responds to multiple pillars of health simultaneously. But here's why that's actually good news. The things that shift it are the same things that improve virtually every other longevity marker that we know of. So when you optimize for HRV, you're not just chasing one narrow metric. You're pulling on the threads that run through your entire biology. So let's walk through what the main ones are. So sleep is probably the most powerful place to start. Each one night of significant restriction measurably reduces your HRV the following day. And deep sleep in particular, when parasympathetic activity is at its highest, seems to be the critical window where your autonomic nervous system actually recovers. Get that right, and a lot of the other pillars become easier to build on. Closely tied to this is your aerobic fitness. So VO2 max correlates really strongly with HRV across all age groups, and regular zone 2 training, which is that sustained moderate intensity cardio, where you can still hold a conversation, but still feel aerobically challenged, directly increases your vagal tone over weeks to months of consistent practice. It's not that fast. It's not HIIT training, but it's one of the most reliable levers that we have. And then there's something more immediately accessible that most people don't really think about, which is your breath. It sounds a bit odd, but your vagus nerve is unusual in the autonomic system because it can actually be consciously influenced through breathing. Slow rhythmic cycles at around 6 breaths per minute, which is roughly a 5-second inhale and a 5-second exhale, synchronizes heart rate oscillations in a way that acutely raises your HRV, which is a good thing. This is called resonance frequency breathing. And even just 5 to 10 minutes a day produces a measurable parasympathetic response. It's one of the few tools that works in real time. Now, alcohol is worth addressing directly because this one tends to land differently when people see it in their own data. What most people consider moderate or socially normal drinking produces a measurable suppression of your HRV the next day. The mechanism runs through both direct autonomic effects and disruption of deep sleep architecture, two of the most important HRV drivers working against each other at the same time. Now, metabolic health operates on a much longer time scale here, but it's just as important as the others. Visceral fat independently suppresses HRV through chronic low-grade inflammation and insulin resistance and disrupted autonomic signaling. What this means is that improving the quality of your diet, cutting back on ultra-processed foods, and increasing fiber all shift HRV in the right direction. Not immediately, but meaningfully over months and years as your metabolic health improves. And underpinning all of this is stress regulation. Arguably the most underrated long-term suppressor of HRV and the hardest to address because modern life is structured in ways that make sustained stress almost inevitable for most people. Using HRV as a behavior feedback tool. Now, beyond its predictive value for disease risk, HRV becomes something really useful when you start using it as a daily feedback loop. So, most people guess at whether their lifestyle habits are actually working. They assume they're recovering well because they don't feel terrible. They assume their stress is manageable because they're still functioning. HRV cuts through that assumption entirely. When you drink alcohol on a Thursday night, Your Friday morning HRV tells you exactly what that cost. When you stay up 2 hours later than usual, your nervous system reflects that the next morning. When you're heading towards burnout, before the anxiety, before the fatigue becomes unmanageable, HRV often drops for several consecutive days as an early signal. This is really, really useful because it shifts health from something quite abstract to something immediate and visible. The data is right there each morning, reflecting the physiological consequences of the choices you made the day before. If you use it thoughtfully, then it turns your wearable into something far more valuable for your health. But before treating HRV as a definitive health oracle, it's worth being honest about what it can't do. HRV is substantially influenced by genetics. Some people are simply born with higher vagal tone than others, and that's not fully modifiable through lifestyle. Consumer device algorithms vary between different manufacturers as well, which means absolute values often aren't comparable across different wearables. And HRV is not diagnostic. It can't tell you whether you have heart disease or metabolic dysfunction or any specific pathology. It's a signal of autonomic balance, not a clinical test. And there's also a risk of obsession here. People who track health metrics, and this applies particularly to high achievers, can develop an anxious relationship with their numbers that itself becomes a source of stress, which then suppresses the very metric that they're trying to improve. The important thing is to track trends. Make decisions based on sustained patterns. Don't let a single low morning reading derail your day. The big picture: resilience and healthy aging. Longevity isn't built on any single supplement or any extreme dietary protocol or any biohacking intervention. The research across decades and across populations points consistently towards the same foundations, which are sleep, movement, stress regulation, and metabolic health. These are the pillars that determine how long you live and how well you live. Now, HRV matters because it gives you a real-time window into whether those foundations are actually working. It integrates your cardiovascular resilience, your nervous system health, your recovery capacity, and your biological aging trajectory into a single number that updates every single night. It turns abstract lifestyle advice into visible, personable, actionable data. The people who age well, who remain strong and sharp and independent in their later decades, are not the ones who found a shortcut. They're the ones who built the right foundations early on and kept them strong. And heart rate variability is one of the clearest signals that we have for knowing whether you're on that path or not.